Welcome everybody. Chapter 41 is called In the Heart of the Empire. Equipped with the important written decree of the Council of Jerusalem, Paul soon set out from Antioch again, partly to set at rest the anxiety of the small Galatian churches which he'd founded on his first tour, and partly with his mind on further expansion of the church. He invited Barnabas to share in this second foreign mission enterprise. Barnabas agreed, providing his young relative John Mark could also be one of the party. This proposal Paul flatly turned down. Mark had deserted them before, and Paul would not have him. The two older men had sharp words on the subject, the upshot of which was that Barnabas and Mark went off on their own to Cyprus, while Paul, with a new associate, Silvanus, set out to break new ground. Having revisited the young churches in Galatia, where Paul picked up a new recruit, Timothy, to take the place of John Mark, they headed westward. But for one reason or another, they were prevented from working in every promising area into which they tried to penetrate. And they found themselves eventually at an apparent dead end in Troas, on the Aegean Sea, the site of ancient Troy. Yet, looking back later on in this unsuccessful tour, they were able to see the hand of God in the very frustration of their plans. For it was at Troas that they were moved to cross the sea from Asia Minor into Macedonia, thus taking the good news officially for the first time into what we now know as Europe. An important fourth member joined the team at Troas. This was Dr. Luke, later the author of the third Gospel and the book of Acts, which becomes from this point in the story Luke's personal version of what happened. If he was a Christian doctor practicing in Troas, he may have been called in to attend Paul during one of his bouts of illness. And it may have been at Luke's suggestion, reinforced by a vivid dream of a Macedonian, perhaps Luke himself, saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us," that Paul decided that this was what God was calling him to do next. It is noticeable that at this point, Luke introduces "we" into his narrative. He's now telling the story from the inside. So they took the first available ship across the Aegean in the autumn of AD 49, and at Philippi, a few miles inland, the scene of the famous battle between Brutus and Antony a century before, they founded the first Christian congregation in Macedonia, with a successful businesswoman, a fortune teller, and a jailer as their first Gentile members. The mission ended with a beating and an imprisonment for Paul and Silvanus. But the little church grew in numbers and became Paul's favourite among all the communities he founded, the only one he allowed to help him with money, and the church to which he later wrote the most affectionate of all his New Testament letters. It would seem that Luke stayed on in Philippi to consolidate the mission. The narrative changes back from we to they and loses much of its vividness. But the other three went on to Thessalonica and Beroea, where the mission resulted in the formation of two more Christian congregations. The campaign in Thessalonica lasted long enough for Paul to take a job at his own trade as a tent maker. The ancient world was full of religious charlatans who sponged on gullible audiences, and it was Paul's proud boast that he supported himself, and often his companions too, with the sweat of his own brow. Jewish opposition to Paul eventually drove him out of Macedonia. Silvanus and Timothy, being less notorious and in Jewish eyes relatively harmless, could be safely left behind to build up the young churches. Paul had another attack of his illness at this time, but despite it he went on by ship to Athens, the home of poets and philosophers, and the most lovely city in the ancient world. But Paul had no eyes for the glories of its architecture, or if he had, he saw its temples and statuary as monuments to ignorance. Athens was to him a hotbed of idolatry and trivial philosophizing. It was not the Parthenon that moved him, but the sight of an altar dedicated to God the unknown. Word of this strange little Jew with a new message, accosting passers-by in the marketplace, came to the ears of the philosophers of the city, and Paul was invited to state his case before them. Although he went out of his way to meet them on their own ground, his claim that God had raised Jesus from the dead was too much for them. He left Athens with the laughter of the philosophers still ringing in his ears. Apart from making a few converts, he had to reckon that his mission to Athens had been a failure. It was as a despondent and discouraged man that Paul went on to Corinth, a large commercial seaport with a population of 500,000 and a reputation for profligacy which was proverbial in the ancient world. He found work at his trade, but his depression did not leave him until the arrival of Silvanus and Timothy from Macedonia, with the news that the little churches there were growing by leaps and bounds, and that Christianity had become a talking point throughout the whole area. This was the tonic that Paul needed. Until then, he'd not known whether his message and his missionary technique, which had been successful in the East, would be equally successful further west, among people of different races and backgrounds. His experience at Athens had led him to think not. Now, however, he could plunge into missionary work in Corinth with confidence and new vigour. From Corinth, he also wrote letters of encouragement and helpful advice to the Thessalonian church. Paul stayed in Corinth for 18 months, building up a congregation drawn largely from the poorer class of the city, with a fair sprinkling rescued from the gutter. The whole of this second tour had lasted about 3 years, and by the spring of AD 52, Paul was back in Antioch. Next year, he was off again on his travels, revisiting the young Asian churches he'd founded, and eventually making Ephesus, in the far west of Asia Minor, his headquarters, for a campaign lasting 3 years, during which time the whole province became his parish. Luke gives us a lively picture of Paul's battle against the practitioners of black magic who preyed on the superstition and credulity of the people. We can see him working at his trade, holding meetings wherever possible, keeping in touch with the churches everywhere. The church at Corinth was causing him particular anxiety at this time, and from his letters to them we can glimpse both the magnitude of the problems he had to cope with and the difficulties of a young church struggling to hold on to Christian faith and standards in the midst of paganism. Before he left Ephesus, he almost paid the price of his success as a missionary with his life. The city was renowned for its Temple of Diana, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world and a popular centre for pilgrimages. The craftsmen of Ephesus, silversmiths and coppersmiths, did a roaring trade in souvenir images of the goddess, which they sold to pilgrims. Now, as a result of Paul's mission, trade had slumped. A mass meeting of the craftsmen was held which ended in a riot, and it was with difficulty that Paul was dissuaded from trying to quell it. He would certainly have been torn to pieces. From Ephesus, Paul went back to visit the young churches in Macedonia, and also stayed for a while in Corinth. Again restless, he was now planning to visit Rome and even Spain, and his great letter to the Romans, which has been called the Gospel according to St. Paul, was written at this time to tell them of his intentions. It gives us some idea of the fantastic range of the apostle's mind to read this powerful exposition of the Christian faith, in which he unfolds God's plan for the salvation of the world, and then to contrast it with the detailed practical concern for the daily life and welfare of a single congregation illustrated in his letters to the church at Corinth. One of Paul's great anxieties was the safeguarding of the unity of the church. It can readily be understood how difficult this was, with small scattered congregations, some largely of Jewish background, some mainly Gentile, with differing native tongues and diverse cultural and racial backgrounds. Apart from his own personal influence, exerted through visits and letters, he laid great store by a money-raising scheme. he had devised whereby the young churches throughout the Mediterranean world were encouraged to contribute to a fund for the relief of the poverty-stricken Mother Church in Jerusalem. This was not only to further a sense of unity, but also to bind more closely together the Jewish and the Gentile traditions within the Christian Church. His intention, after his third missionary campaign, was to head a delegation of representatives of the younger churches to Jerusalem, which would take the contributions of their various communities to the Mother Church in the Holy City. So he made his way eastwards, picking up the delegates on the way, including Luke from Philippi, at which point the we of Luke's travel diary replaces the impersonal they of his narrative, and once more the story gains in vividness, which is now maintained right to the end. In one of his letters, Paul speaks of the various ordeals he's had to face in the course of his missionary activities: imprisonment, floggings, shipwrecks, cold and hunger, danger from floods, bandits and angry mobs. Luke mentions some of them, but when we see how his story comes alive when he was actually present, it makes us realise what a tale he could have told if he'd been with Paul all the time. There's a sense of foreboding in the narrative at this point, almost like the account of Jesus' final journey to Jerusalem. Paul knows that Jewish fanaticism is building up against him, and he seems to have recognised that this would be his last visit to the Holy City. On arrival there, he was given a cautious welcome by the Jerusalem church leaders. But despite his readiness to go to almost any lengths to show his respect for Jewish traditions, he was set upon by an infuriated mob in the temple because of a wholly false report that he had taken a Gentile into the enclosure forbidden to non-Jews. He was saved from certain death only by the prompt action of the commander of the Roman garrison, who was quartered in the temple precincts to deal with emergencies of this kind. This was in AD 56, and from now until the end of Luke's story, Paul is in Roman custody. It was only his Roman citizenship that stood between him and the bloodlust of Jewish fanatics, determined by hook or by crook to be revenged on the arch-traitor. The anxiety of the succession of Roman officials who dealt with Paul's case to protect him from the murderous designs of his Jewish compatriots is a tribute to the power of Roman law. If Paul had not been a Roman citizen, he would never have survived his last visit to Jerusalem. Instead of that, he was taken for trial under escort to Caesarea, seat of the Roman government in Palestine, where he spent 2 years in prison, mainly due to delay in appointing a new governor. The only person who would seem to have profited from this prolonged stay in Caesarea was Luke, who no doubt used his time to advantage to gather information about the ministry of Jesus and the early days of Christianity, which he later incorporated into his 2 books. Whether Paul was tired of his protracted confinement, or whether he was alarmed that a new charge of treason was being brought against him by the Jews, he brought matters to a head by formally declaring, "I appeal to Caesar." This meant a demand for trial in Rome by the Supreme Court. Thus Paul achieved his wish to visit Rome, but under far different circumstances from those he'd intended. Luke's dramatic story of the voyage to Rome, including shipwreck on Malta, is a masterpiece of descriptive writing, and he ends his account of the first 30 years of church history with a picture of Paul in the capital, waiting for his appeal to be heard. On the surface, it would appear to be an unsatisfactory ending. What happened to Paul? Was he tried and acquitted? And did he then set out on further adventures? There is a possibility that he did. But whatever happened, early tradition is unanimous that he was martyred at the same time as Peter in AD 64, during the persecution of the Christians under the mad Emperor Nero, who laid at their door the blame for the great fire of Rome which destroyed half the city. But in finishing his book where he does, Luke had achieved his aim of showing how the gospel had been brought from Jerusalem to Rome, through the guidance of the Holy Spirit, and mainly through the work of Paul. Luke's last words in the book of Acts show that he meant the story to end there with Paul in Rome, in his own rented house, free to receive visitors, and, as we know, also able to write letters to the churches and free to proclaim the gospel in the heart of the empire without hindrance from anyone. The church had reached the end of its childhood and was now ready to advance to the conquest of the world for Christ.